This is today's News Talk. TNT.
Welcome back to this live broadcast, ladies and gentlemen. We're still in the first hour here. I'm your host, Patrick Henningsen, live and direct for the next 2 hours on TNT, today's News Talk. Now we're going to pivot over to Europe. There's a lot going on. This has been an eventful week, and not for good reasons. Early in the week, we found out an assassination attempt on Robert Fico. This is the Slovakian prime minister. This raises a lot of questions, especially when we learn that the motivation of the shooter in this attempted assassination is the fact that he was clearly upset that his country, that his leader was curtailing aid to Ukraine. In other words, didn't want to participate in NATO's proxy war against Russia in Ukraine. It's very strange, but very disturbing at the same time. I want to welcome onto the stage a great political commentator. He's also a historian based in Europe. Tarik Cyril Amar is joining us on the line right now. Tarik, welcome to the program.
Hi, Patrick. Thank you for having me.
It's great to have you as well, Tarik. There's a lot of things that we need to kind of unpack here. I mean, I also want to speak about what's happening in the former Soviet Republic of Georgia and that farrago that's going on right now. And I'm sure you have some thoughts to share. Your writings on this have been very, very good and very poignant up at RT.com and on your blog as well. So Tarik, firstly, we have to talk about this attempted assassination of the Slovakian Prime Minister, Robert Fico. What are your initial thoughts and your reaction to this?
When I first heard about it yesterday, I was shocked, obviously, and I personally take it extremely seriously. Obviously, somebody has been gravely injured. There has been an attempt at murder. So that's a serious matter in and of itself, but the politics are also very disturbing indeed. As you mentioned, I think, in your introduction, one thing that is special about Fico is that he has been critical of the proxy war that the West is waging in and over Ukraine, as it were, against Russia. You also have to add the fact that Slovakia is interesting because it is actually a NATO member. And the NATO treaty, you know, if we take it seriously, and apparently NATO never takes it seriously, but according to the actual NATO treaty, you need every single member to be on board to accept a new state as a new member. And Fico has actually come out, I think, in as recently as April, and he's been explicit and said, with us, you're not going to have Ukraine in NATO ever. We don't like it. It's actually not making us more secure, and the purpose of NATO is to make its members more secure after all. We feel less secure with Ukraine and NATO because we think that's a recipe for triggering a large conflict, and in fact we are already seeing that, and we will never vote in favor of it. And de facto, if you take the treaty seriously, every single NATO member state has a veto. So Fico has been very clear about a month ago that, you know, it's not going to happen on my watch. Slovakia is against this. The optics of this, as they say, are appalling. Obviously, we don't want to speculate too much, right? So the Slovakian authorities themselves have come out and said he's a loner or a lone wolf, I think is the phrase they used, something of that sort. That may or may not be true. It is true, as you have pointed out, that one of the issues, there were several, but one of the issues that has agitated this man, Cintula, or Cintula is his name, was the fact that Fico was no longer going along with the engagement in the proxy war. And it is also true, and I think this is very important, that other people have pointed this out. We have been through a period in which having a different opinion on confronting Russia in this way has been demonized to such an extent that even if there isn't a direct way in which this particular shooter has been put up to it, it is, as it were, in the water, in the very toxic water that is now Western discourse, and in which you could almost feel that somebody like Fico, well, you know, it even in the responses to the attack, you can see in the West that their responses then border on blaming him. He's blamed for the polarization that allegedly led to this. He's blamed for being a divisive figure. Every other article, at least Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, New York Post, New York Times, you name it, they all call him pro-Russian or somehow aligned with Russia. And there is an image being created that, in a way, he had it coming, right? And that's very symptomatic. There is something now going on in the West that has become so intolerant of having a perfectly reasonable alternative view of foreign policy, and a very important issue of foreign policy, that makes people like Fico already be at risk or being in danger.
And the media coverage on this, just the mainstream media's reaction. I want to share a clip with you, Tarik, from UK Sky News, and the way they covered this, the way they framed this, it's very interesting, and it really reflects what you have just said just now. Let's go ahead and roll this, and I want to get your reaction to this coverage. Go ahead and roll this clip.
We don't know his condition yet, but he's being treated. But it's worth thinking about who this individual is. As I said, described in reporting as a populist, as a nationalist. Yeah, well, that would make sense. I mean, Slovakia is a very conflicted place at the moment. I mean, Fico himself, he established this smear party, SMER, which is a social democracy party, back in 1999. And he's been, I think, as you were just saying, Prime Minister 3 times. So he's a well-known figure. But he's become very pro-Russian over the years, and one wonders why and how, but maybe that's his conviction. And like Viktor Orban in Hungary, he's set his teeth against going along with sanctions, with EU sanctions, against common procurement. Slovakia is it's a small country, in the sense that it's the Czechoslovakia as was. The Czech Republic is the bigger bit. Slovakia is the smaller bit, although it was the more industrial in the old days. So it's not to be, it's not negligible, but Slovakia is not a major player within the EU, but a bit like Hungary, which is also a bigger country, but it's not a very big player in the EU economically. They dig their toes in against aid to Ukraine and against any sort of sympathy with Kiev. And they keep saying, look, we want the war to finish. Yeah. And by that, they mean they want the Russians to succeed, and then the war will be over if Ukraine would just surrender and give up territory. And so that's the view he takes. Now, that's very divisive in Slovakia. It's divisive within the EU. So it's not surprising that this sort of event might take place, because it's a very unhappy country at the moment, Slovakia. Not just on this basis, but on the basis of how the country is going in general towards a more authoritarian future or a more conventional West European sort of future.
Oh my goodness, I don't know where to start. Tarik, there. What did you pick up? What really stuck out for you on that clip?
I think the first major sort of smear that they were using against him was to imply that his foreign policy position on Russia is the product of some sort of corruption, right? They were very strongly implying that this is not genuine, this is maybe his conviction, but that implies maybe it's something else. So he has already been caricatured as some sort of, agent of Russia, or being in the pay of Russia, or being a useful idiot of Putin, all of this nonsense, obviously. And when you look at Fico over his long political development for more than 20 years, that really doesn't make any sense. He has just traveled an actually fairly plausible ideological trajectory. He has undergone a development, and he has come out with consistent positions that make perfect sense. You can disagree with this, but to simply slander him implicitly as not being genuine about him, that was strike number one, right? And then the second one, of course, was to depict him as a nationalist, a populist, as pretending that he's trying to take his country onto some sort of authoritarian pathway, describing his whole country as an unhappy society, obviously blaming him for it. Also pretending that he is out of sync with a large part of the Slovak population. And we know from polls that that's not the case. There are very different views in Slovakia, but a large share of the Slovak population actually does look at this conflict in Ukraine and other issues in similar ways to him, which after all makes perfect sense because he was elected, right? He's not some sort of tyrant. He didn't come in with a military coup. There is a reason why he won an election. He didn't get an absolute majority, but he got enough of a majority to go into coalition with similar-minded politicians from other parties, or one other party, I think, I'm not quite sure. And his power, his authority is perfectly legitimate. There's really nothing to guess about that, right? It's based on perfectly legitimate elections, not worse than in many other European countries. So this whole spiel that they were producing there on Sky News, really misrepresenting him as if he's some sort of sinister political adventurer whose authority in Slovakia, whose right to speak in Slovakia's politics, whose very high office, he is the most powerful politician as PM in their country, that all of this is somehow not genuine. I mean, to be honest, Sky News, as far as I know, is British, isn't it? Now, if they want to see a PM who doesn't have legitimacy the way Fico has, that would be Rishi Sunak, quite literally, who's never won a popular election and owes his office to basically a Tory club, coming to some sort of desperate conclusion after they had been through several others. Fico actually has won a real election, unlike Sunak, right? So this whole Sky news segment, I think I'd seen it before, but it's very good you brought it up again. The problem with it is it's not only really quite dastardly, it's quite representative. Not everybody is that brutal about it, but the tendency, I've seen that in a lot of Western reporting, including in major outlets that have reputations to lose. Again and again, the New York Times was, just comes to my mind at an article that essentially struck the same tone, right? Let's try to sort of blame all sorts of things on this guy. Most of them are actually not even true. And then let's insinuate that somehow he is at least partially to blame for what has happened to him.
Yeah, the impression I got, Tarik, was that from their reporting, he had it coming. Yes. He sort of deserved it because of his divisive views. They said divisive. So basically challenging the European or the Eurocrat consensus on Ukraine makes you divisive and contentious. Yes. And according to Sky, unpopular. According to Sky.
Well, he's unpopular in Brussels.
I would contend. And I would contend, Tarik, that his position on Ukraine, at least in that part of Europe, does probably represent the public consensus, not the political class consensus, but the public consensus. What's your opinion on that?
I can't give you the exact figures, but I did look at some polls, and it's very clear that he has like half the population or something like that. When you ask them about that specific conflict over and in Ukraine, voice views that converge with his very clearly. But it's not only that. It also, for instance, concerns supply of gas from Russia, energy policy. It also concerns purely domestic Slovakian issues. And I'm not saying I agree with him. I probably not agree with him on many things. But it is actually quite easy to find out that this is somebody who represents a solid share of Slovak opinion and whose legitimacy as a politician is no worse than that, as I've already said, many other European leaders. So this whole idea, what we are now seeing, and this is very worrying, is that, and it brings us, I think, to the topic of sovereignty, right? That there is sort of a meta rule in play, which is you can win your election, you can go through the usual processes of parliamentary politics, you can abide by the constitution, but if you dare pursue a policy, even if it's popular in your country and you have a mandate for it, that clashes with what people in Brussels want, then suddenly there's another second rule that says you're no longer legitimate, which of course means you completely undermine the sovereignty of any country that this is done to, right? Because their internal political processes suddenly stop mattering. What decides whether a politician, a leader in this case, is legitimate if is if he's in sync with mostly unelected bureaucrats in Brussels. That's the other irony, right? And I have to add one more point. Look, when I hear Fico being called a populist, to me, that is another enormous warning signal, because by now I think the term populism, which may have a better use, but by now what it means in the West is somebody who actually cares about getting voted into office and having popular backing. It is somebody who actually takes democracy seriously enough to want popular backing, right? Which is the essence of democracy. He's not a populist in the sense, yes, he has used sharp rhetoric, but not worse than many, many others, once again, in France, in Britain, and so on and so on. There's really no difference here. He's not a populist in any term that implies that he's not a good Democrat. He has played by democratic rules. He has abided by laws. And what they're saying by saying populist is he is not obedient towards mostly unelected elites. That is very strange indeed.
The other thing, the real kicker came at the end of that Sky report, and when they said what Fico wants to see an end to the war in Ukraine, and that would allow Russia to succeed, they said, and that would allow Russia to succeed and take the territory they've gained. Isn't that the real issue?
Because that was a brutal lie.
So that kind of says that's the game, basically, isn't it? That's the central move of the game. Yeah,
you're absolutely right. I forgot that one, right? But you're absolutely right, and that is not even just about Fico. That is the old game, as it is a game, as you point out, of caricaturing anybody who believes in diplomacy and in compromise as a defeatist, right? It couldn't possibly be the case that what Fico wants, like other people, like I would actually, is that we come to a negotiated solution, which Ukraine won't be perfectly happy with. Nobody will be perfectly happy with. At this point, probably the Russians will be a little more happy because the war has gone on so long that they're winning it. But still, we can end the bloodshed, we can end the destruction, we can end this war, but we would have to negotiate and actually do quid pro quos, real ones. That's not defeat. That is not what they implied. They implied that he just wants to see Ukraine and implicitly the West defeated. And I don't think that's the case. I think that, like many other marginalized people in the West, what he would like to see is negotiations and compromise, and that makes perfect sense.
It's very interesting, isn't it? Because Slovakia, Fico, he doesn't want to bring his country into the firing line in a major war or an escalation of the conflict. And neither does Georgia as well, Tarik. And I know you've spoken, written about the recent developments in the CIS country, former Soviet Republic of Georgia. And this has also been on Europe and NATO's kind of shopping list, hasn't it, for a very long time. And you saw this attempted color revolution in the last couple of weeks, once again, in Georgia. It doesn't look like it's successful, but there's a lot of effort being put into destabilizing this country. What did you make of the recent law that's passed? The street reaction to it, the European officials from Germany going and lecturing Georgian, parliamentarians and things like this. It's an incredible scene.
It is, yeah. They are doing their best, those European officials, like, Landsbergis coming in from Lithuania, Michael Roth coming in from Germany. They're doing their very best to make it look like almost a caricature of a color revolution by now, right? The scheme is so old. We've seen it so many times. It's sort of they're jumping the shark, actually, with this. But I think it is on the verge, at least, of an attempted color revolution. I think if it were to turn into a successful color revolution, in quotation marks, then many people in Europe would be very happy. They're certainly playing with that option, right? And the underlying issue, as you've pointed out, is that the Georgian government is passing a law, has passed a law. It's not yet fully valid because there's another process involving the president, and that will be conflictual, but they've passed a law in parliament that aims at transparency in the NGO sector in Georgia. This is often called, even in reputable media, foreign agent law. That is literally untrue. It doesn't use this term, and it is not a foreign agent law. But if one wants to simplify this law, as in many other countries, a great expert on this says there are about 70 countries in the world that have similar laws, right? 70. It aims at least establishing some sort of transparency control over the way in which outside actors from outside the country, other countries, but also foundations and so on, can influence the politics of Georgia through financing NGOs. And my position is that in principle, the West only has itself to blame. That's point number one, because the West has a habit of abusing NGOs and similar structures, National Endowment for Democracy, European Endowment for Democracy. Those are, by the way, exactly the two big organizations that the Georgians are most worried about right now. They're at the core of this, and they're hardly ever named. The West has a habit of abusing the NGO sector to undermine the political processes of countries it wants to somehow control, or where it wants to achieve certain outcomes, like be against Russia, and so on and so forth. So the law is, as far as understood from much more competent commentators on this, not perfect, but it is also wrong to caricature it as a copy of a similar law in Russia in 2012. In fact, somebody who has worked on this, Armut Rakhovansky, for many, many years and knows the Russian law inside out and knows the Georgian variant now, says they're not variants at all. They're very different laws. The only thing they have in common is that vaguely the purpose of controlling outside influence is there. But once again, 70 other countries are doing the same thing, as you know, including the United States, who have had a law like this forever. These laws are not always the same, but the principal purpose of somehow trying to get a handle on the way that outside actors can buy themselves influence in your polity is actually not uncommon. Now, the European Union is doing something extremely nefarious here, because it is telling the public in the European Union and in the world and in Georgia that by passing this law, which is perfectly legal actually, the Georgian government somehow forfeits its option of becoming a European Union member. Now, 80% of Georgians, for various reasons, we know this from polls, do want to be in the European Union. They may be making a mistake, but that's what they want, right? For various reasons. So the European Union is using this as leverage. It's basically telling the population in Georgia, well, if your government passes this law, we are going to take this away from you. Right? Now, talk about foreign influence. That in itself is a massive manipulation of the political process inside Georgia. That in itself. So there are different layers here, but they're all about, again, as we said before, I think, they're about outside actors. Here it is the European Union. Most of all, NATO is in the mix as well, by the way, so is Washington, somehow claiming the privilege of really brutally intervening in Georgian domestic politics. Once again, if I may add one point, this is accompanied by massive misrepresentations. For example, the party that is now leading the Georgian government and that is promoting this law and that has made this law, Georgian Dream, is caricatured as pro-Russian. This is not true. They're not pro-Russian. There is a reason why this party has maintained Georgia's intention to join the European Union, even the intention to join NATO, which in the case of Georgia is a terrible idea anyhow, right? They have maintained that. They are not pro-Russian. And the Georgian prime minister has actually come out very clearly recently and said that this whole linkage that is being established, and of course he means the EU, between us passing this law and us changing our foreign policy orientation is false. It's completely false. The ones that are imposing this misguided choice, that's the European Union. It's not coming from the government of Georgia all the government of Georgia is actually trying to do is to control a very small number of highly aggressive NGOs that have a track record of going far beyond what is legitimate for an NGO, talking openly about uprisings, about toppling the government, about replacing the government through technocratic government. There is a small number of NGOs in Georgia that have been doing this. They are being financed by Western institutions. Once again, the European Endowment for Democracy is one of them, very much in the mix there. And it seems that the Georgian government was trying to resolve this diplomatically and that they basically hit a wall. And after they hit a wall, they basically then started resuscitating this law. They tried to do this once before, about a year ago, didn't work, and now they're trying to do it again because they don't see another solution. And the EU is very much to blame for this.
It's very interesting. The critics are saying it's a threat to free speech. They're really pumping this up as some sort of, authoritarian piece of legislation. Pretty unbelievable. And the president, Salome Zorabishvili, she herself, a type of a European import, very interesting background. She has straight from the United States via France, parachuted in, not unlike Mikhail Saakashvili, who was working at a New York law firm and found himself to be president of Georgia. I mean, so she's saying that this law is terrible. She's going to repeal it, etc. What do you make of her in this mix?
I think that given her position, she should have remained neutral. I think that would have been the only decent position for her. I understand that she may not agree with this law, but her very aggressive intervention here doesn't make sense because she knows that she has a right to veto this law, but Georgian Dream has enough votes to override the veto. So by becoming extremely aggressive about this, she's essentially she's not talking about her own veto. She knows the veto won't work. She is also trying to mobilize the street, right? She's trying to mobilize extra parliamentary power, right? And she's a professional politician. She's the president. That is certainly not her task. And as you've pointed out, she used to be a French diplomat. She used to be trained at some point at Columbia, I think at Sciences Po as well. I think even good old Brzezinski is in the mix at some point in her life. She is very much an import. In fact, she's so much an import that this may be a bit different by now because this is several years ago. But a few years ago, it was a fact that her Georgian isn't very good. Her Georgian then was not good enough. There were Georgians who were making the not so implausible argument that, if you want to really have high office in Georgia, maybe you should actually know the language fluently, not just like sort of, which was her case at least a few years ago. That's how much she is somebody who was parachuted into Georgia, very much from the West. And it would have been much, much better if in this conflict she had taken a demonstratively neutral position. That I could understand. But what she is doing now is she is joining those who are ready to topple the current government, which once again is a legitimate government, over this law. And the law has been passed in a legal way. If she vetoes it, that's her right. But if her veto is then cancelled by once again a majority in parliament, that's the right of that majority. And then that law becomes law. And she should actually live with the process instead of reaching for means outside that process, reaching for help from foreigners. This is literally what she's doing, and reaching for violent protests in the street. This is also what she's doing. It doesn't make sense.
She's reinforcing the things that critics of NGOs and foreign influence are pointing to. She's actually reinforcing these through her reaction. It's quite remarkable in politics. Tarik, the situation in Georgia, you're starting to see people breaking ranks, be they in Hungary, Slovakia, other parts of Europe as well. Belgium is another good example of a country that's diverting from the Brussels consensus on some big issues. Now, there were talks of color revolutions, and there's these sort of movements, and these things have been seeded around these various countries, but it hasn't the revelation of Ukraine and what's happened, to see a country torn to pieces, to see this used as a cudgel against Russia. Are other countries that would normally have allowed this type of political infiltration or been sort of maybe indifferent to it, they're looking at Ukraine now? How much of a game changer is this going forward? In other words, is there a rising of political awareness on some of these issues because of how far they pushed Ukraine?
You know, I think there should be, definitely. Look, if you even compare the rhetoric, right? Those EU politicians that are now going to Tbilisi, the capital of Georgia, and speaking to the crowds and making the crisis worse, I think. They have adopted the same slogan they used for Kiev for a long time, which is Tbilisi is now the capital of Europe, right? They think that's great praise. But the irony, of course, is that in the case of Kiev and in the case of Ukraine, that sort of talk was a kiss of death, quite literally. That preceded a horrific catastrophe and a horrific war. So I cannot imagine that there aren't people who see this, that there are not people who see that the price of this model of letting the West color revolution you can be horrific. And think about the Georgian situation. What is so particular about Georgia is that they've already had a war with Russia. They've had a war with Russia in 2008. In fact, when the West, when NATO made that insane promise that back then at the Bucharest summit in 2008, where they said, Georgia and Ukraine are going to be inside NATO one day. We won't tell you when, but one day they will be in there, massively provoking Russia for no good reason at all. The war in Georgia was the first one that happened. It happened within months. And of course, the details are complicated, but it was certainly in many ways a response to that insane promise. And then it took much, much longer in the case of Ukraine. However, I find it difficult to believe that there aren't more and more people who realize what a terrible example Ukraine has been for one other reason, which is what is happening in Ukraine is not only that hundreds of thousands, literally, of Ukrainians have lost their lives. Like Zelensky pretends like 35,000 or something. That's ridiculous, ridiculous. The country is full of massive military cemeteries, and they're growing and growing and growing. They've lost about 20% of the territory, and it can become more again. None of this has worked. Ukraine is not simply a story of enormous sacrifices. That would be bad enough because they were made for no good reason. It's a story of losing on top of it. At the end, Ukraine will have suffered horrifically, and even by the metric of the West and the Zelensky regime, they won't have achieved their aims. They will have failed. Right? This is the worst of all possible worlds. The other country, and it's a different part of the world where I hope people are watching this and drawing their conclusions, is Taiwan. Taiwan is another society that is being prepared to serve as some sort of bulwark against a geopolitical competitor of the West, and if need be, in a bloody war, in this case, China. I personally very much hope that people look at the case of Ukraine and do learn from it, because what has happened there is a catastrophe. There is no upside to it at all.
And this kind of brings us, got a couple of minutes left. This is a really important point here. Both, if you look at these two main conflict zones, these two main flashpoints, Ukraine and Israel, Palestine, in both cases, and almost unprecedented, in both cases, there's an active effort by the G7, NATO, Western countries led by the US to prevent a negotiated settlement, to prevent ceasefires in both cases. Yes. And this leads to, as we saw from the Sky News clip, with if you want the war to stop, somehow that's a divisive position. This is a terrible thing to do. That's going to allow Russia to win or allow Hamas to win. This is the way the narratives are being spun right now. And I find this to be a very, very concerning kind of moral inflection point for Western civilization. I know we've talked about this in other segments before, Tarik, but just on that point alone, how dangerous is this to things going forward? And obviously the risk of a wider war is what a lot of people are worried about, but your final thoughts on this. I'll give you the floor for the last 3 minutes. Go ahead.
I think that we are looking at a very strange constellation. It's almost a paradox. The West is getting weaker in relative terms. There's no doubt about this, right? The US are still very powerful, but if you look at the way that China and is rising, that Russia has reasserted itself, that other countries are also staking out now their own politics, their own sovereignty, the West is definitely getting weaker. At the same time, it is getting, as you've outlined, much more rigid. So it has now become good tone in the West to not believe in, you call it what you want, compromise, negotiation, win-win. The only idea that we have now, and that is dominating our discourses, and we are trained in it, is this very brutal zero-sum logic. If we make a concession, then it's a win for them. And if it's a win for them, it couldn't possibly also be a win for us, then it's a loss for us. And you see this in very concrete terms. You've mentioned the way in which the West is positively sabotaging the urgently necessary first step of a ceasefire in what I think is a genocidal massacre that Israel is committing in Gaza. But it's also, when you look now at the latest Russian advances in Ukraine, one reaction we have seen today is that high-ranking NATO militaries have come out saying, oh, we need to send more trainers closer to the front in Ukraine. You have other people like, basically a NATO spokesperson who sits in some think tank, Ulrike Franke, releasing another piece of writing where she says, well, we don't really want to have a direct clash with Russia, but we really have to think about it because it might become necessary. It is almost obsessive. The West has given up on the idea of being able to de-escalate a conflict by negotiation and coming to a decent outcome other than by total winning. And here is the rub. The West is no longer capable of total winning. It is capable of great destruction, but it is not capable of total winning. So that doesn't even work as a way of ending conflicts. And that gets you to the last point you mentioned. I think you're absolutely right. If the West cannot even end conflicts this way, and if it never wants to de-escalate, then at the end there is further escalation. And since we have a very severe proxy war already, I mean, the Ukraine conflict is in a way like the Korean War used to be. In some ways, it's similarly severe, at least, in 50-53. The only way up from there is world war, right? There's no other step you can take. From something like Korea 50-53 or from Ukraine now, if you escalate further, you end up with global war. And I don't really see us being sufficiently aware of that or beginning to change our policies yet.
And the other thing is, the more the West insists on this agenda, or wherever the ideology is, it's not softening or creating more, centrist positions in these areas. It's hardening people's positions and reinforcing their suspicions of the West. Take Donbass, for instance. Or Crimea. They're not winning over the people of Crimea with these European ideals because they're looking at them like they want to get rid of us. I mean, it's incredible. Your final thoughts.
You could, that logic, I think, would also apply to Georgia. I mean, if somebody is turning Georgia towards Russia, it's the West right now. We are now teaching a large part of Georgian society, if they haven't seen it yet, and we're teaching its government and its leading party and an important segment of its political class that we are ultra demanding, we blackmail you, we intervene massively in your domestic politics. Georgia has a very difficult relationship with Russia, but it is probably us, the West, and especially the EU, that are pushing them towards getting closer to Russia. It's exactly the other way around from what we are hearing. The problem is not that the party that is ruling the country, Georgian Dream, is pro-Russian. The problem is that with our ham-fisted intervention, if anything, we will convince them that there isn't a good way of living with the West, and maybe, yes, they have to reorient toward Russia. We can get them there.
Yeah, and you're seeing this pattern. It's being reflected in a bunch of different areas, and we're hoping that that feedback loop somehow makes it back to Washington and Brussels, and they realize that this isn't actually working out the way we wanted. Maybe we should try a different approach. I don't know. It's revolutionary thinking. I do hold out hope that maybe that might take hold at some point, but we're not holding our breath. Unfortunately, there's more to discuss on this. Tarik Cyril Amar, thank you for joining us on TNT this week.
Thank you. Thank you.
And do follow Tarik on his Substack, also on Twitter, X, formerly known as Twitter, if you want to stay up to date on excellent commentary and great takes on the world's events. He's one of the accounts to follow. Top there are news headlines coming up. We got a whole lot more on the other side. Tony Gosling, Sam Husseini, looking forward to this. Stay with us.